Hello, everybody. This is Bennett Tchaikovsky, also known as the accounting professor. Welcome to my presentation here today. We're going to be going through a problem whereby we're going to be solving things with both single plant-wide and activity-based costing. We're going to start first with single plant-wide. My disclaimer and copyright notice: the opinions in this presentation are those of myself and not my employers, including but not limited to South Orange County Community College District and Irvine Valley College. The contents of this presentation do not constitute any legal or accounting advice whatsoever and are for educational purposes only. Presentation is copyright 2024 by Bennett Tchaikovsky. All rights are reserved. Any distribution without my prior written permission is strictly prohibited. So let's go ahead and get over to our part right over here. So this is a new question that I've gone through and have created, which is we've got a YYZ produces two models of electric bicycles, 80 and 100. The 80 kph sells for 4,000, while the 100 kph sells for 5,000 per unit. The 100 kph is more customized and requires additional attention during production. The direct materials and direct labor costs of each of the bicycles are as follows. So 4,000 units of Cape 80 are produced, while 1,000 of 100 are produced. And then we get some information relating to the factory overhead. Okay. So if you're taking my class, what I'm going to be asking you to do is I'm going to give you information like this. And then I'm going to be going through and asking you to what I'm going to be asking you to go through and to do is to fill out this chart. Now, our sales price over here for 80 kph is going to be 4,000, while the 100 kph is selling for 5,000 per unit. We also know over here that my direct materials and direct labor for the 80 kph are 2,800. My direct materials and labor for the 100 kph are going to be 4,600. Okay. So when we're going through and looking at when we're looking at costs, what I want you to be going through and thinking about is we have this overhead. And when we're in production, right, direct materials and direct labor are generally very easy to go through and determine, right? So these are going to be easy things for us to sit down and to go through and to figure out. What becomes more difficult is how do we take this overhead and allocate it? Well, there's at least three ways. Single plant wide, which we're going to be talking about today. Departmental, which I'm not covering in my class. I did that for a while. And then lastly, there's activity-based costing. Now, the reality is activity-based costing tends to be more of an academic exercise. However, it's still tested in some places. So that's why I continue to go through and to teach it. But again, it's another way of going through and allocating. So the important thing to go through and remember like right over here, there's a basically the reason why this is really important to kind of go through and think about is that this is an article, and I probably have shared this thing before, but the question becomes is how can a movie that grossed 475 million on a $32 million budget not turn a profit? And when you kind of sit down and kind of think about it, it oftentimes, and that's the way Hollywood does things, is very different. But the reason why I'm bringing this up to you is that if you're in a place at some point in time in your career where you're compensated not only on your base salary, but you're also compensated on how profitable your particular company is it important for you to understand how your profit sharing or whatever may have you will be going through and being determined? The answer is absolutely yes. You have to understand that. Very, very important, because if a big portion of my salary is being determined on essentially, if a big portion of my salary is being determined on, how profitable my division is, I want to know how that's being determined, because depending on the methodology of the counting that's being used, I can all of a sudden, something that I think is doing really well and is profitable all of a sudden becomes not. So that's why this particular chapter, just keep it in the back of your mind. We're not trying to manipulate the numbers, but what we are trying to do is to explore the different ways that overhead can be allocated. Remember, direct materials and direct labor, we know how much materials we put into a project, right? That's pretty easy to figure out. We know how much labor we put into a product. The hard part is figuring out how do we allocate overhead, right? And where it doesn't cost such a huge amount, but we need to know how much our products cost. So for single plant wide, what we're going to go through and do is we're going to take the total amount of the overhead, and then we're going to divide this by my total driver. Okay. So single plant wide, I'm taking the total amount of my overhead of 3.8 million. And for the driver, I need to be told, what am I going through and doing this on? Now over here, using a single plant wide based on tests used in production. So the total cost for the testing was only 20,000. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But the number of tests we had totaled 100. That's the total driver. 10 were used by 80, 90 were used by 100 kph. So over here, my total drive is 100 tests. So coming over here, right? So again, I need to figure out the per unit over here for single plant wide for my factory overhead for the 80 kph and for the 100 kph. I then need to figure out what my total costs are, and then that'll give me my gross profit or my loss. Total cost of a product, materials, labor, factory overhead. So let's come over here. So if I have over here 3.8 million divided by 100, this is going to be $38,000 per test. Okay. So the way I'm going to go through and allocate out this 3.8 million is going to be based on tests. So I have two products. If I had more than two, I would just add them up over here. I have the 80 kph, which had over here, this had 10 tests, right? Right over here, I've got 10 tests. Over here, for my 100 kph, I had 90 tests. So the way I'm going to go through and do this is the overhead per test. This is going to be 38,000. This is going to be also be 38,000. My total allocation is going to be 10 times 38,000 or 380, 90 times 38,000 or 3,420,000. So the amount of overhead I'm allocating 380,000 to 80. I'm allocating 3,420,000 to 100. How do I know if this is correct? I need to add up the 80 plus the 100, and I get 3.8 million, which is my total overhead. Single plant wide, I'm taking the total amount of the overhead, dividing it by the relevant driver. So when we come down over here, if I were to say, oh, my factory overhead is 380,000, and this over here is 3,420,000. No, we don't do that, right? That's the total amount being allocated. We're being asked over here to be doing this on a per unit basis. So what I now need to do is I need to take the total allocation over here for the 80 and the 100, and I need to divide this by the number of units produced. So my units produced basically over here for 80 kph was 4,000. So my cost per unit is going to be 85. For the 100 kph over here, what I'm going to be going through and doing, my overhead cost per unit. So this is going to be 3,420,000. I'm going to divide this by 1,000, and this is going to give me 3,420 as my overhead allocation per unit. So coming over here, my per unit for the 80 kph is at 95. My per unit for the 100 kph is going to be at 3,420. Now, when I add up my total costs over here, I get 2,895,000. When I add up my total costs over here, I get 8,020. So my gross profit for the 80 kph is my sales price minus my costs. And here I'm going to have a loss of about $3,000. Now, we've gone through and computed this, right? So that's the first step we're going through and doing. By the way, do companies sell product at a loss? And let's take a look at our friends at Rivian. If I go through over here and take a look at my friends at Rivian Automotive, okay, I come down over here and I look at the financial statements of Rivian Automotive. You'll notice over here for the year ended 2023, their costs of revenues exceed their revenues. This happens for a multitude of reasons. Oftentimes, when we're trying to gain efficiencies of production, Tesla was kind of the same way. When we're trying to gain efficiencies of production, the cost of the revenue as we're ramping up can actually exceed the cost. So if this, in fact, it was the case that we're losing money basically on a just by the cost exceeding what we're selling it for, that's generally not a good thing because we want to be selling things for more than they cost. However, if we're at a place where we're earlier on in our production life cycle, this may be something that is being planned or we're intentionally going through and doing this. Now, the one other thing I'm going to mention to you right now is that over here, what I'm going to ask you, we're going to ask you this a little bit later, but if we said over here, instead of using tests, would there be another cost to go through and use to allocate overhead? And I want to kind of just address this right now. What's the problem with us choosing to use tests? Well, the problem is that the testing costs relative to the total overhead only represents it's less than 1%. And is that really a good way to go through and allocate overhead? Meaning I'm choosing to do the single plant-wide rate based on something that is very, very low. So when I'm going through and answering this particular question, right, instead of using tests based on your results, what would you advise the manager to do? And we'll see once we compute ABC. But the problem with using tests, the challenge with using tests is that tests makes up less than 1% of total overhead, or 20,000 divided by 3.8 million. Many of my students make the big mistake when they're giving an analysis, you have to quantify it. We need to let our numbers go through and do the talking, right? Therefore, a better method or better overhead representation may be to use, coming over here, possibly something like machine hours, right? Why would I want to use machine hours? Well, this is roughly about 1.8 million. Right over here, the assembly, that could potentially be something too, but the machine hours may be a better way to go through and approach it. Machine hours, because machine hours represents approximately 1.8 million of the 3.8 million of total overhead costs, or approximately 47% of total overhead. Okay, so that may be a better way to go through and to use it, right? Why would we want to go through and do this? Because it's a better representation of the total overhead costs. So when we go through and look at this over here, we've gone through and we've computed the single plant wide. Now, our jobs as managerial accountants is we would be going to our supervisors as, hey, if we choose to go down this route using this methodology, this is basically what's going to be going through and happening. So I'm going to go ahead and end this video now. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you on the next video, which I'll be making momentarily. If you have any questions, please feel to reach out. Thank you for liking and subscribing to the channel. And I look forward to seeing you on future videos. Have a great day.